Well, this afternoon at Lesley University, we gather to think about and discuss the implications of Far From the Tree for our understanding of how we can best ameliorate child homelessness.
Well, thank you all for the incredibly warm welcome in those beautiful introductory remarks, the loveliest perhaps that I've ever had, and for all of you coming here today. I also had the privilege this morning of spending some time with a group of Lesley students and faculty, and I have to say it's really thrilling to see so many people who are so intelligent and have such kindness and who are devoted to helping others. So it's my first morning at Lesley University, but it's been a wonderful one, and I feel really lucky to be here and to be here with all of you. Thank you for that. As you will have gathered by now from the introductions, I've written a book, and this talk will draw from the book. And in a way, when I got this invitation, I was a little taken aback because the book is in some senses about the exact opposite of what we think of by and large when we think of child homelessness. It's about how families have managed to engage with children who present some form of difference or difficulty. There are many forms, of course, of everything, but I tend to look at child homelessness as occurring in one of two domains. There are the children who are homeless because their families have thrown them out and want nothing further to do with them. And there are the children who are homeless because their families are homeless or because they're with others who are homeless, whatever one uses by way of defining family. And so they're homeless in a different kind of context. And in working on the book, I wanted to talk both to people who had privilege and opportunity and people who didn't. And while it's a book about family and therefore about the ways in which people achieve some form of love for one another, it also deals in some measure with the experience of rejection. Leanna mentioned the child poverty rate in the United States. The UNICEF figures, which came out relatively recently, show that in much of Western Europe, the rate of child poverty is about 6 to 7%. In the UK, which is the worst in Western Europe, it's 12%. In Bulgaria and Latvia, it's respectively 18 and 19%, and in the United States, it's 23%. And there can be no excuse, really, for our having a rate of child poverty that's as high as that, for that kind of suffering of children in a country which remains, economic boom times or otherwise, one of the most prosperous in the world. So the existence of child homelessness in the United States it's a terrible thing, and it's a pervasive thing. Indeed, it's a ubiquitous thing, and it's wonderful that it's now finally being addressed and being studied. I have looked in the book at a number of forms of parental love and parental rejection, parental love against the odds, as I've sometimes said. I'm going to begin by describing the basic principles that are laid out in the book and some of the families who are there, and then I'll loop back around to the specifics of child homelessness and indeed some of the other darknesses that may surround children, even if they are not legally and officially categorized as homeless. I was assigned about 20 years ago to write an article for the New York Times Magazine about the deaf. And at the time that I got the assignment, I was a little bewildered by it because I had mostly been doing foreign reporting. And my editor said to me, but this is a foreign society within our own culture, and it is therefore one that you might be able to penetrate and understand. I had thought of deafness as merely a disability. Those poor people, they can't hear, what a sadness for them. And then I went out into the deaf world, and I went to deaf social clubs, and I saw deaf theater. I attended the Miss Deaf America contest, which was really something. I went to houses in which the alarm clocks flashed lights instead of making a sound, and I came to understand deafness as a culture. It's not my culture, and I didn't particularly want to become a member of it, but it had its many seductions, and I thought it was just as valid as the many cultures that I am part of. And then I discovered that most deaf children are born to hearing parents, and that those parents, by and large, tend to think that the deafness is something that should be fixed or repaired and make efforts in that direction. and that the children frequently discover deaf culture when they hit adolescence. And suddenly they have a community of people united by the use of sign language, and it becomes as a great liberation for them and a great deliverance. And so I thought this situation seemed very familiar to me, and it seemed familiar to me because I'm gay, and I'm the gay child of straight parents. Most gay kids are the children of straight parents. And no, really. And I think straight parents, time out of mind, have essentially thought that the best way forward for their children would be to try somehow to make them straight. And those children have tended to find identity in a community of like people from a peer group, often in adolescence or later. And as I looked at that experience and I looked at its connection to the deaf experience, I thought this is really a striking parallel. And then a friend of mine had a daughter who was a dwarf. And it turns out that most dwarfs are born to parents of average height, that those dwarfs often have parents who are very uncomfortable with their appearance, and that there's a long process in which the children eventually find themselves some form of identity. And I thought, okay, if this has happened for gay people, and it's happened in a way for deaf people, and here it is happening for dwarfs, and if there's this strange commonality among all of us, I thought, then who else is there out there waiting to join this throng? And I really went very deep into trying to find the different communities that there were, and I eventually defined those terms alluded to in the introduction of vertical and horizontal identity. And I said that there are many identities which are passed down generationally within families. So one's ethnicity, one's nationality, one's language, often one's religion. These are things that parents have in common with their children. And I called those vertical identities because they come down the family tree. And while some of those vertical identities can be difficult in some contexts, nobody is working on curing them or making them go away. People are working on figuring out how to lead a strong and vital life, even if one has a defining difference from a large part of the rest of society. When you get to these other identities, which I've called horizontal because the identity is learned from a peer group, like deafness, like gayness, like dwarfism, the other topics in the book are Down syndrome, autism, schizophrenia, multiple severe disabilities, families of prodigies who are also quite overwhelmed, families of bringing up children conceived in rape, families of kids who commit crimes, families of people who are transgender. When you look at all of those situations, they're all situations in which a family that perceives itself to be relatively normal has a child whom they perceive to be extremely different. And those identities are all identities which people have always sought to cure or to fix because parents are ill at ease with them. Now, child homelessness frequently has to do with parents being uncomfortable with their own children. Sometimes it has to do with parents who are uncomfortable with having children altogether, or with parents who aren't able to take care of their children. But there are a lot of children who are different in some way and who are therefore thrown out. So almost half of the children available for adoption in the United States at the moment have special needs of one kind or another. Almost half the children is still a relatively small proportion of all of the people who have got differences and disabilities, but almost half the people available for adoption have these differences because so many families, when they're confronted with a child who has a signal and significant difference from them, withdraw, disengage, pull back. And so what I've written is a kind of manual for how one establishes a loving relationship with children who are different. What is the process of self-extension through which people are ultimately able not only to love these children, but to find a very profound meaning in doing so. I'll talk a little bit about some of those successful strategies, and then I'll return again to the question of homelessness. I certainly felt in my own childhood that the idea of difference was a potent one and a continuing one. When I was little, I was diagnosed with dyslexia. My mother worked very closely with me on reading, and obviously, reading and writing, I've done all right with that. So that was a successful address. But I think there was also creeping evidence of another perceived neurological strangeness, which was my being gay, and that there was a tendency to think we'd trumped one and we'd trumped the other. So I have the story that when I was little, I remember going to a shoe store with my mother and my brother, And when we finished getting our shoes, the salesman asked us what color balloons we'd like to have. And my brother said he wanted a red balloon. And I said I wanted a pink balloon. And my mother said, I think you'd really like the blue balloon. And I said, no, I really would like the pink balloon. And she reminded me that my favorite color was blue. The fact that now my favorite color is blue, but I'm still gay, is evidence of her influence and its limitations. So I throw that out to you. One of the issues that has been striking to me, and I think it's really very relevant as we look at all of the attempts now to help people integrate children who have differences, is how much our relationship to various differences has shifted and changed. I'm going to read you two excerpts from magazines that were published when I was a child. This is from Time magazine, late 1960s. Time magazine was not a particularly conservative publication. This is what they wrote. Even in purely non-religious terms, homosexuality represents a misuse of the sexual faculty. It is a pathetic little second-rate substitute for reality, a pitiable flight from life. It deserves no encouragement, no glamorization, no rationalization, no fake status as minority martyrdom, and above all, no pretense that it is anything but a pernicious sickness. So how have we gone as a society from a time when that was the voice of the mainstream to a time when we have a president who's come out in support of gay marriage? It's a very complicated question. And I will now read to you from the Atlantic Monthly in 1968, again, a voice that was relatively far to the left, on children with Down syndrome. There is no reason to feel guilty about putting a Down syndrome baby away, whether it's put away in the sense of hidden in a sanatorium or in a more responsible, lethal sense. It is sad, yes, dreadful, but it carries no guilt. True guilt arises only from an offense against a person, and a Downs is not a person. So when we look at the idea that those are points of view that were being expressed just a little more than 40 years ago, and we look at the response that everyone now immediately has to what Joseph Fletcher wrote in The Atlantic, I think we understand how fluid these categories are. And when we look at families who have rejected children and whose children have therefore become homeless, the logic seems transparent to those parents for why they are doing that rejecting, but it's all really very mutable. The qualities that these parents find so appalling, they might feel differently about at another point in time. And so I've said that there's always a tension in any of the identity categories that I've looked at between illness and identity. And that one can experience almost anything as an illness. It has a negative valence. It prevents you from doing things you want to do. Being very young is in some ways an illness. Being very old clearly is. Being a member of any given ethnicity or religious group may be construed as an illness. There are contexts in which being an American can so be construed. But any of these things is also an identity, and there is a genuine identity element in all of the conditions that I've looked at. And the way that families process this tension between illness and identity is central to helping those children to be in love with their children, to be devoted to them, to be dedicated to them. One of the most important coping mechanisms for these families who are ill at ease with their children is to be able to construct some kind of positive meaning out of what's happened. So one of the families that I spent time with was the family of a dwarf. His name is Clinton Brown. He has something called diastrophic dwarfism. And when he was born, the doctors at the hospital said to his parents that they shouldn't bother to take him home because he wasn't going to live very long, was never going to walk or talk, and they would take care of him and, until he died, and that they should just go home and not think about it anymore. And his mother was shocked by this suggestion and said that after giving it some serious thought that she wanted to take her child home and at least try. And so she took Clinton home. By the time he was 10, she had found a surgeon who could help him with some of the complications from the condition he had, diastrophic dwarfism. She worked as a phone operator. Her husband was a construction worker. They didn't have a lot of privilege. They didn't have a lot of access. This was happening in the 80s. They didn't have access to the internet. Nonetheless, she managed to find this doctor at Hopkins who works with kids with dystrophic dwarfism. And in the course of Clinton's childhood, he had 30 major surgeries, on the basis of which he, in fact, now is able to walk. And while they were doing all those surgeries, he had nothing in particular to do at home and in the hospital but read his school books. And so he ended up being incredibly good at school and became the first person in his family to go to college. And when I talked to his mother one day, she said to me that she was in a complete state because she was able to drive. He had a specially fitted car. He was going to college not far from where they lived. And she said, I was driving home and I saw his car parked in the parking lot outside a bar. And I thought, his friends are 6 feet tall, he's 3 feet tall, 2 beers for them is 4 beers for him. She said, I got home and I was crazed with worry and I was leaving messages on his cell phone. She said, and then I thought, if someone had told me when he was born that my future worry would have been that he'd go drinking and driving with his college buddies, I'd have been so thrilled to have that problem. And I'm just going to read you, I said to her, but he's an amazing and charming guy, and I said to her, how did he come to turn out that way? What did you do? And his mother said, what did I do? I loved him, that's all. The other day, these people much higher up than us socially, much more educated, called me up and said they couldn't handle this. They were in Texas politics and thought the stigma would be harmful to them. And they gave their baby up for adoption. That's just what they were going to do. And it's the opposite of what I was going to do right from the beginning. The other day, Clinton came home and he goes, Ma, I saw a blind man today with a stick in Manhattan. There were people rushing back and forth, and he was all alone. I just felt like crying. I felt so sorry for him. So I offered to bring him to where he needed to go. Clinton just always had that light in him. And we were lucky enough to be the first to see it there. It's so striking that that family was able to embrace their child, and that what she's describing is a family who rejected their child. Now, a child being put up for adoption is not the same as a child being homeless, but many children who are put up for adoption and who have these kinds of severe disabilities end up in the foster care system. Children in the foster care system suffer a rate of PTSD which is twice as high as the rate suffered by soldiers who have served in the US Army in our actions in the Middle East. So what is the future? What prospects does that child have? How likely is it that that child at some point will be abandoned or will be homeless? And why would those parents see it that way and these other parents see it so very differently? In looking at autism, one of the things that was striking to me about families dealing with kids with autism is, in the first place, how the diagnosis is presented to those families. Often, the doctors say these terrible things when they're giving the diagnosis. They're dismissive of children with the very conditions that they're diagnosing. And when that happens, I think it can have a very poisonous effect, because what you're told when you first find out makes a gigantic difference to what it's going to be like for you to process the fact that you have a child who's different. So doctors who say, as one family doctor said to someone, you have given birth to a circus dwarf. Or a man who said to a couple who came in with their 3-month-old child who was showing signs of disabilities, he turned not to the mother but to the father and said, take your pretty wife home and make yourselves another baby, because you're never going to get anything out of this one. Those ways of delivering the news can have catastrophic knock-on effects. They cause people to think, if we allow the kind of metaphor, in the way of the Texas folks who were, and I love Texas, but the Texas folks who I've just described who were rejecting their child with dystrophic dwarfism, rather than in the direction of the family, the Brown family whom I've described. Autism is an enormous drain on people's resources. It's an overwhelming and exhausting experience having a child with autism. There are many people who find it a rewarding experience, and there are many people with higher functioning autism who have said that their autism is who they are, and that they really want their families to accept them for who they are and not to keep trying to fix them. I had the privilege of spending time with a family called the Davis family, Jay and Bill Davis and their son Chris. And they, again, were not people with enormous obvious advantages in life. He was a bartender. She had been doing various kinds of piecemeal work. When their son was diagnosed with autism, she felt she had to understand what autism was. And she went around and she started trying to find people who could treat her son and his autism. And she kept looking up the ways there are to treat autism online and finding out more and more about it. And she kept getting in the car, and her husband was very distressed by this because she didn't have a license. And he said to her, "You can't keep getting in the car and driving our child all over the place without a license." And she said, "I'm too busy dealing with this right now, I'll get a license later." And when she went to the various places she went, people often said to her, "Look, this program is full, you don't have a place to be here." There was one story which I loved of her interviewing someone and just showing up in his office at Penn State, someone who had been working on autism and who she thought had good ideas. And he said to her, "Lady," he said, you have to go, I'm leaving now." And she said, "You don't understand." She said, "You're actually not going to leave your office until you agree to help me." And she was standing in front of the door, and 2 hours later he said, "Okay, I'll help you." And eventually, when she had set up her own program for dealing with her son with autism, he sent people up there to do internships with her and learn from the techniques she developed by wedding all of these ideas together. And I always loved that she did, as a way of giving people an understanding, when she hired a new intern, she would say, and she had a group of interns who she worked with all the time, she would say, "Okay, it's so great that you're here." She said, "I want you to come into the next room, and we've hidden something, and if you can find it, we'll give you $200. And the intern would say, "Okay." And then they would go into the next room, which would be pitch black with people making all kinds of clicking noises and strange sounds. And at some point, the voices would start saying, "Go on, find it, and I'll give you $200. And the new intern would say, "But what am I looking for?" And they would say, "You can find it, you'll get $200. And finally, when the intern walked out in a state of sort of fury about the whole thing, Jay would come out afterwards and say, "That's what life is like for autistic children. All these demands they don't understand, this confusion, this chaos." It turned out to be a very powerful metaphor. I met Jay the week before she died in her 40s from cancer, when her son was 12 years old. And she was an incredible powerhouse. And her husband is also quite a powerhouse, but he was finding it very difficult to manage things alone. He was trying to keep his job going. He was trying to take care of his other child who was non-autistic. He was trying to take care of Chris and keep all this stuff that Jay had got started going. There was huge fanfare about Jay dying. There was a Jay Davis Award that was set up by the city where they lived, the city where they had struggled with the social services agencies. There were all kinds of special Jay Davis things going on, but there were no resources for the family. And within a year, everything had fallen apart. Bill described how he was working 4 bartending jobs, bringing home sometimes $2,500 a week. "But I swear to God, we couldn't pay our rent. When things got really bad, I'd hold a bar fundraiser. I'd solicit a baseball from the Phillies. I went to the Flyers and got hockey sticks. I'd sell it all at the bar and raise $6,000 at a clip. But that didn't cover the cost of taking care of that child." So Jay pushed Chris so hard, and when she died, he said, "No school," Bill recalled. "I thought, well, if what he really wants is to watch television all day, should we keep pushing him to do all these other things? But then we were charged for truancy, and then we had Jay's medical bills, and the family became homeless, and they were living on park benches. I had been in touch with them, and then I couldn't reach them anymore, and I didn't know why. And finally, Bill called me and told me about what was going on. They eventually found someone who took them in, and they were able to rebuild things. But I thought, what kind of a system do we have in which such a coherent model has been set up? Someone is being treated so well for his autism, and the family then unable to meet these medical bills, both for the wife's illness and for the son's condition, that they should be forced into homelessness. And what effect does it have on someone with autism? People with autism like consistency, regularity, they like things to go on the same way, they have a hard time with disruptions of routine. What does it mean when you have someone like that who now finds himself not only without his beloved mother, but also without a place to live, sleeping in a different park every night? The trauma that causes is almost beyond description. I was very, very struck by the pain that these families encountered. And I was struck by how much the prospect of homelessness defined what people did. So I interviewed one woman whose son had schizophrenia, and when he was diagnosed, she began saving up, again, from a very limited income, and eventually managed to buy a little house in her neighborhood in Malden, not so far away from here, and she said everything went into getting the money to buy the house, and I said, but why? And she said, because, she said, schizophrenic people are so often homeless, she said, and even if it won't help my son, who in fact died before she did of other complications, she said, what is the likelihood that this will surface in the next generation or the generation afterward? I watch all my grandchildren and I wait to see which of them is next. And I want to be sure that they don't end up homeless. This threat of homelessness, this visibility of people who have mental illness and are homeless, it ran so constantly through the work that I was doing and the people I was interviewing. Now, I talked a little bit about the family with the dwarf and how they found meaning. I'm going to describe just a few other families to give you a little bit of another sense of what that meaning looks like when people are able to find it. So a family called Tom and Karen Robards, whose son David was diagnosed with Down syndrome, and they talked a lot about the way in which they had been sort of hard-charging Wall Street types. They were more privileged. When their son was diagnosed, they looked for good educational opportunities for someone with Down syndrome, and they couldn't find anything very much. And they ended up founding something called the Cook Center, which started as a tiny little operation to educate kids with DS, and which grew into a vast and impressive network that really altered the way those kids are educated all over the country. And when I talked to them, I said, do you regret it? Do you regret that you had a son with Down syndrome? This has been such a huge part of your lives. And his father said, well, I regret it only for my son, because for my son it's a hard way to be in the world, and I'd like him to have an easier life. And then his mother said, you know, I'm with Tom. For my son, I would love to change it because it's been so hard. But she said, speaking for myself, though I would never have believed I would think this 23 years ago when he was born, speaking for myself, it's made me a better, kinder, more generous person than I would ever have been without it. And so speaking for myself, I wouldn't give it up for anything in the world. And part of my purpose in the book is to describe those experiences and those situations so that people will understand what the other option is. It's not only an option that you can either reject your child completely or you can sacrifice your life and be miserable for the whole rest of your life. There's also the possibility that you'll have an intense and meaningful experience. Would those parents, if they had been given the abstract choice, have chosen a child with Down syndrome? No. But would they now want to give up the child they have? I don't think they would. I went to the funeral of one of the children I was writing about who was severely disabled, couldn't walk, couldn't talk, was in a group home and drowned when someone in the group home left him in a bathtub by himself, which was not supposed to happen. And when I went to his funeral, his mother said, "Let me bury here the rage I feel to have been twice robbed, once of the child I wanted, and once of the son I loved." I'm going to skip forward and talk a little bit about the experience of crime. When I decided I wanted to write about families of people who've committed crimes, I had the idea that I would take a job working in a juvenile prison in Minnesota, which I did. I worked there for a while on a theater project, not as a guard. And I got to know a lot of the kids and I got to know a lot of the parents. A lot of those kids had themselves been homeless. A lot of them had grown up in families that were broken or damaged families, families that in many instances had dealt with homelessness at some stage. And I found that the social services system that addresses problems such as homelessness and the prison system, which addresses problems such as crime, seem to have never heard of each other. And when I looked at some of these kids, I thought, okay, it's true that this child did a really terrible thing, but it's also true that this child has had a really terrible life. And one of the kids said to me, and it was so poignant, he said, "Everyone here complains so much about their parents, and I just wish I had parents to complain about." And I felt that there was that isolation over and over again. And I also felt that it was possible to have a deep and abiding love for someone who had committed crime. I interviewed Tom and Sue Klebold, the parents of Dylan Klebold, who was one of the perpetrators of the Columbine massacre. It took a long time to persuade them to talk to me, and when we finally had our interview, we sat together for almost the entire weekend, recorded more than 20 hours of tapes, and at the end of that weekend, the first, as it was to turn out, of many I would spend with them, I said, if Dylan were here now, do you have a sense of what you'd want to tell him or what you'd want to ask him? And his father said, I sure do. I'd want to ask him what the hell he thought he was doing. And his mother looked down, and she thought for a minute. And then she looked back up and she said, I would ask him to forgive me for being his mother and never knowing what was going on inside his head. And a couple of years later, when we were having dinner, she said, when it first happened, I used to wish that I had never had children, that I had never married. If Tom and I hadn't crossed paths at Ohio State, Dylan wouldn't have existed, and this terrible thing wouldn't have happened. But over time, I've come to feel that, for myself, I am glad I had kids and glad I had the kids I did, because the love for them, even at the price of this pain, has been the single greatest joy of my life. When I say that, I am speaking of my own pain and not of the pain of other people, but I accept my own pain. Life is full of suffering, and this is mine. I know it would have been better for the world if Dylan had never been born, but I believe it would not have been better for me. And I thought that that analysis was so unbelievably full of love. Now, soon after I had had those conversations with Sue Klebold, I was working on families bringing up children conceived in rape. And there was one woman whom I interviewed, and at the end of the interview I said, as I often do at the end of an interview, do you have any questions for me? We were in Rwanda, and she was one of the many women who had been raped and had children of rape from the genocide. And when she looked back at me, she said, not the usual questions, which were, will this be published in French? How long are you staying in Rwanda? Questions like that. She said, can you tell me how to love my daughter more? Because I want to love her so much, but I look at her and I remember what happened to me. And I was so shocked by the question, I sort of took a step backward. And she began to cry, and she said it again. Can you tell me how to love my daughter more? And I thought of that question when I started working on families of people who are transgender. About half of people who are transgender are rejected by their families of origin. A huge number of them end up homeless, they end up living on the streets, they end up selling their bodies in order to pay for their lives. And I was really shocked. I went to several shelters for LGBTQ youth who were without a place to live. They were homeless, they were moving from shelter to shelter, some were hoping to be adopted, some had been put in abusive foster situations. The suffering of that population was almost inconceivable. And I interviewed one woman who's quite a remarkable woman. I've called her Ann O'Hara in the book. She had worked as a special needs educator in a school in a small town in the Deep South. She had a child who was in her class who had terrible problems, but the people who had brought him explained that his mother had schizophrenia, that he had just been taken away from her, and that the way she had dealt with her 3 children was to keep them all tied to a pole in the place where she lived and feed them her antipsychotics instead of taking them herself because they sedated the children. And so Anne was determined that she would figure out whether this child really had irresolvable problems or whether this child was someone she could help. And over time, she got him to start speaking. He had had no language when he arrived. And then she found out that he and his siblings were going to be split up and sent to different foster homes. And she said to the social services agencies, is there anything I can do to keep those 3 kids together? It's the only continuity they have. And the social services people said, the only thing you could do would be to adopt them. And so that's what she did. She adopted these 3 children, all with terrible behavioral disturbances and strange behavior. And one of them eventually, who had always seemed rather feminine, began saying, I'm really a girl. Don't you see that I'm a girl? I can't live as a boy. And after doing a lot of research and meeting with a therapist and doing everything she could, she decided to let him live as a girl. And she went into the school and said, look, we're doing this over the summer, but in the fall, my child is going to come back and she's going to be coming as a girl, and we're going to be using this girl's name. And it's a situation, this transgender situation, I can explain it to you, here's a book about it, so on and so forth. She said that by the time she got home from that meeting at school, the phone calls had begun. I didn't recognize the voices. They were going to gut her. They were going to cut off her genitals and treat her like the woman she wanted to be. They were going to snatch her from school or in a parking lot, and I would never see her again. Some of them were going to raise her upright. Some of them were going to kill her. She's 8. She's the tiniest kid in the class. I thought the Ku Klux Klan were just a bunch of fools who dressed up in their costumes. It turned out they were in charge of things. And soon thereafter, she got a call from her pediatrician asking her to come see him in his office. She said he had been sitting around the country club pool with the other people from the local Baptist church. He said, people are not talking about if they're going to hurt you and Kelly. They're planning when and how and what they're going to use to do it. You have to put your child in a foster home somewhere else, or he's not going to live till the next school year. So Anne, who was not willing to divide up these children or to give up on them, took them and piled everyone into the camper that they had, their car. She could fit everything except the family dog, and they drove off, and they were for a while homeless. And eventually she met another mother online, another mother of a transgender child, who said, there's a southern town where I live where things aren't quite so bad. It was actually a suburb of a major city. She said, if you come here, I'll try to help you. And so this was another family that was dealing with homelessness. And when I talked to Anne about what that experience was like and about what they had been through and about her loss of everything, her husband stayed where they'd lived because they needed his salary to pay any sort of expenses at all, including the medical expenses for the kids. When he came home from work the day after they'd left, he found the family dog disemboweled and nailed to the fence with an indication that the child was next. And I talked to Anne about this whole experience, and she said, I don't love my daughter less for mourning over this, but I miss my mom, I miss my sister, my daddy's grave is back there, and I just have to hope other people are putting flowers on it. I miss my dog, I miss my students. I feel really guilty because I'm still hung up on all this stuff that we left behind. I should just let that go. But it makes me so angry that these people have taken our lives from us. And then she smiled and she said, but you can't grieve all the time when you've got your kids. You see how far they've come, and they reach you right in your heart. That moment when they come off the bus is one of my best moments. My other is when they get up in the morning and they collide on top of me. So regret? No. I miss the things that were in the old life. But if I knew this was going to happen, I would still adopt Kelly. I'm the lucky one. Because honestly, if it weren't for Kelly coming into my life, I would never have entered this bigger, more beautiful world where I've met you and so many other wonderful people. I mean, if you just look at it, Kelly has brought more blessings into my life than I could possibly give back to her. So it's possible to go through that experience of being homeless, of having been driven into homelessness by your child, and still be grateful for the life that you have. And I hope that one of the effects of this book will be to let people understand what that quest for meaning looks like and how it feels. I decided to have children while I was working on this book. And lots of people said to me, how can you decide to have children in the middle of a book about everything that can go wrong? And I said, you know, it's not actually a book about everything that can go wrong. It's a book about how much people are capable of loving one another even when everything goes wrong. And so I will just, as a conclusion, briefly explain that my husband is the biological father of 2 children with some lesbian friends in Minneapolis. I have a daughter with a college friend. They live in Texas, but she had been through a difficult divorce and wanted to have kids, and I wanted to be the father of her child. And then my husband and I have a child who's with us all the time, of whom I am the biological father, and our surrogate was Laura, one of the lesbian mothers of John's 2 biological children. So the shorthand is 5 parents of 4 kids in 3 states. And it's turned out to be the glorious experience of my life. It's separate from this question, obviously, of homelessness, and yet when I look at all of those trans kids I met, when I look at all of the people with autism who are abandoned, when I look at all of these kids who are abandoned, I had to think through, would I be able not to abandon my own child in the face of anything like this? The day after our son was born, the pediatrician said he was not extending his legs correctly and that she thought he might have some form of brain damage. And we had a terrifying period when we were getting a CAT scan and the doctor had a very dark view of things. And I thought to myself, can I make this into an occasion for bonding and connecting rather than an occasion for being alienated and dissociated? I'm going to close by reading you the very final chapter, the very final paragraph, of the book. Children ensnared me the moment I connected fatherhood with loss, but I am not sure I would have noticed that if I hadn't been immersed in this research. Encountering so much strange love, I fell into its bewitching patterns and saw how splendor can illuminate even the most abject vulnerabilities. I had witnessed and learned the terrifying joy of unbearable responsibility, recognized how it conquers everything else. Sometimes I had thought the heroic parents in this book were fools, enslaving themselves to a life's journey with their alien children, trying to breed identity out of misery. I was startled to learn that my research had built me a plank and that I was ready to join them on their ship. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you again for an amazing talk. I've known for years that you're a wonderful storyteller and speaker. Now I know that you can also do that with incredibly bright lights shining right on you. I'm even more impressed. So in the literature on children growing up in settings of adversity, I think there's a tension. And on one side of that tension, there's a real focus on brokenness, on trauma, and really the terrible legacy that adversity can have on children and on their families. And you certainly very eloquently capture some of that in the stories that you share. And on that side of the tension, we see a kind of a child trauma field that's developed. And there's certainly a really strong body of literature to document the legacy of trauma that adversity can leave. But on the other side of the tension, and I think you captured this so eloquently as well, is a focus on resilience, on the remarkable capacity of children and families to somehow pull the pieces together. Maybe not right away, maybe not right at the beginning, but to somehow find a way to come out, perhaps not unscathed, but still intact. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about what you learned in the process of researching and writing this book about what leads to those better outcomes.
Well, that's a central question, I think, of this book and of my life. What is the nature of resilience? My last book was a book about depression, and when I was working on that book, I was very struck by the fact that there were people who would describe what sounded, as they talked about it, experientially like not such serious depression, who nonetheless were incredibly disabled by it. It was the only relevant fact about their lives. And other people who had what sounded like much more traumatic and terrible depression, who nonetheless seemed to have had lives that were rich and meaningful, at least in the interstices between their depressive episodes. And so I began looking at that question of resilience. For families who are dealing with the kinds of difference that I've looked at, I think the centerpiece of resilience is the ability to construct meaning out of what happens. And one of the parents who I talked to said, you know, it's not just that God doesn't give you anything that you aren't up to. It's not just that there's somehow meaning meaning there and that we only have to discover it. We construct that meaning, we build that meaning, and it's our ability to build that meaning that allows us to be the parents we are. And there's no question in my mind. So I also interviewed a number of families where people said, my child has autism and I wish I'd never had this child. I love him, I'll take care of him, but if I'd known what it was going to be, I wouldn't have done it. And I felt like the people who constructed meaning were able to be happier in their own lives and to care better for their children, and their children appeared to do better on the basis of having parents who were not so angry and so dismayed. But for the people themselves who are actually dealing with these conditions, I mean, I think constructing meaning also is key insofar as people are able to do it. But the thing that I found was most defining, and it sounds a little hallmarky, but it really was true, is how much love there was around them. So if someone understood himself to have a quality that was widely agreed to be a disadvantage, but felt nonetheless that his family completely loved him, he was much more likely then to be able to form friendships, to be able to form ultimately his own love relationships, to be able just to function well. And the people, and again, as we're here about homeless children, it's true of some of them, the ones who are growing up with love, even if they've been displaced, are going to have an easier time than the ones who've been thrown out of their families and who've been made to feel as though they're unlovable. That, I guess, is the central mechanism. But it's not a very useful thing to say to people, you're having such a rough time, you know what would make you feel better? If only you were really beloved, then everything would get better. It's harder than prescription, but it is in fact my experience.
Thank you. We'd like to open things up now. Any comments or questions that you might have? We can see you. Please.
I wasn't sure that my purpose for being here would be relevant at all to anybody else but me, but listening to you talk, I can put it in there. It's a big question. So starting with, I have a son who's biracial, who was adopted by us at birth. And I wondered if you ever considered using that as one of your chapters, adoption, and particularly biracial adoption, because it kind of fits with the fact that you have a child who's nothing like you expected.
So the question is about adoption and whether I considered it as a chapter for the book. There are quite a lot of adoptive families in the book, a number of whom are doing either cross-racial adoption or in one case, a Caucasian family adopting a biracial child. So it comes up within the other chapters. I did actually think about doing a chapter on it. What I really wanted to do was a chapter on families who adopt disabled children, and I still have the idea that that's something that I'd like to work on at some stage. But for the moment, the book, as you can see, is quite chunky as it is, so I had to kind of draw some line. But I think it's incredibly interesting, and one of the things that was really striking to me was how often adoptive parents, including Anne O'Hara, whose story I told just at the end, how often those adoptive parents were at least as fiercely committed to giving their children the leeway of their integrity as were biological parents. And I found that the adoptive families that I looked at were in most instances very strong families who really had pulled together. Some of whom had taken on children who they knew had problems, some of them who had taken on children who then turned out to have problems. But there was an assumption they encountered over and over again that because they were adoptive parents rather than biological parents, they could get a different child instead. And the father of one little girl who had deafness, but who they had thought had various other things, she eventually came through fairly well, but he said that the adoption agency, when he called and said, we're having these issues and we need more information or background, said, well, why don't you just give her back to us and we'll give you another child. Shortly after they'd adopted him, he said, it's not like you go fishing and you think, no, that one's too small, get another one instead. He was very angry about it, and I found the power of adoptive families and the sense that they had of profound connection, not necessarily a more profound connection than any other family, but a connection they had to keep defending against a world that thought, well, why are you sticking this out? He's not even your kid, is the kind of distressing tagline.
Well, is it all right if I comment on that?
Sure.
Because it's just it brings in exactly what my point is when we adopted our son, we thought he was white. We were told he was white, we met two white parents. And then slowly it became clear that we were lied to, and you know, whatever, and the adoption agency said, do you want to keep it? Which is exactly what you just said. It was, you know, it was absurd to think that we didn't want to keep him, and yet that's the world we live in. Is, you know, as an adoption agency, they quote unquote had to ask us that because maybe we wanted a different child instead. So I just, and it's also the whole idea of visibility versus invisibility, because a biracial child who's adopted is very visibly adopted.
Yes.
It's out there all the time. Thank you very much.
You have such a great capacity, and you inspired the book, people with parents and children work, and it's incredible capacity. Can you say something about what kind of curriculum you would suggest that would cultivate that quality that you so deeply have, and those parents have, that you describe? How can you take that and make the curriculum, make suggestions for curriculum, so that we can create more of that kind of people to work with all of the different components that they deal with?
So the question is about how to create a curriculum that reinforces the capacity for and the ability to love. I will say that when I met with students this morning here at Lesley University, that I was impressed that many of them already seem to have those impulses. And I think there are a lot of people with a great capacity for love who go into social services and get involved. The idea of a curriculum that would help people to love is, I think, I mean, it's difficult. I think love comes more readily to some people than it does to other people, depending in part on their own early experiences and depending in part, I suppose, on their makeup and temperament. I think the important thing is to keep re-injecting the idea that these are emotional realities and not just statistical ones. I use statistics throughout the book, but I made the point in the introduction, and I make it a few other times afterwards, that it's a book of stories. And it's a book of stories because these are human events. And when I say 23% of American children are homeless, everyone is horrified. But when I actually tell the story of what the experience of a particular family is, suddenly people get it and they think, well, we have to do something. Think of that child. There's a different emotional response. And I think that as a society altogether, we've shifted too heavily to describing everything in numbers. And the numbers are useful, and I don't want to throw out all the numbers, but I would like to keep the narrative there. And I think the emerging field of narrative medicine, in which people try to use storytelling as a means of understanding what's wrong with a patient, is a valuable one. And I think if it's possible to have a curriculum in which, again, not that the numbers are all thrown away, but in which there's a real focus on what we're studying has to do with human beings. They're not abstractions. The more you can see the people, the more real they become, the more likely you are to be able to find the love for them.
Come down here because I can't see people's hands. Other
Yes.
questions? Yes.
Oh, okay.
And if you want to, there are microphones here as well.
So I'd like to know what your thinking is about parenting a child who's struggling with substance-related problems. And I know that creates a lot of homelessness. I'm wondering if you consider that, interviewed people. I mean, I've worked with many people, as probably many people in this room have. And one of my sayings is be sure to keep them close. Don't do anything to keep them as close as you can. Not that I don't say get help and all of that, but keep them up with other people. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about this. And so many of those kids, adolescents, you know, we see as it's a failure of parenting or morals or issue of willpower.
Well, it's a complicated and large question about families dealing with substance abusers. And again, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound like a music sort of broken record about it, but there are some families who are dealing with that in addition to other qualities, especially in the chapter on crime. I've just finished reading a book which is both brilliant and disturbing called The Lost Child by Julie Meyerson, which is all about her decision to throw her son out because of his drug abuse and otherwise disruptive behavior. And it's a beautifully written book and an interesting one. I found it a very troubling one as well, and it left me wondering a lot, what is this tough love business, which seems to be the sort of primary address now to having kids who are substance abusers? Does it work? Does it make the kid feel better? Does it make the parents feel better? What exactly is the rationale behind it? I feel like kids who are substance abusers need to have some boundaries drawn, and they need to understand why what they're doing is self-destructive or unacceptable. And they also need to know that no matter what it is they're doing, they're deeply loved and they have a home if the parents are able to provide that. The correct balance, I wish I could give you a formula and say, everyone should do it this way. It varies so enormously depending on the child, depending on the family, depending on the area of the society that that child is in. But I have seen a number of people who have had kids who got into substance problems and who have not known what to do, and I feel there's a lot of facile stuff out there that says, well, you can't put up with that, you can't accept it, you can't. Of course you can't put up with it or accept it, and yet at the same time, you also can't just cut yourself off from a child you've raised and nurtured. The difficulty in some ways is that these problems generally come relatively late. So if you're trying to figure out how to deal with your child with Down syndrome, your child with Down syndrome is completely in your power when you are dealing with the initial diagnosis. You can make all the decisions for an infant. The infant makes almost no decisions at all, maybe whether to eat and when to fall asleep. If you're dealing with someone who's started to become a substance abuser in mid to late adolescence, there's much less parental control that's possible. The parent should understand the limits of parental control, should attempt to exercise whatever control there is, and should not be so angry at not having complete control that they give up altogether. I think that's a dangerous model. But it's a huge field, and the generalities are only that. They're generalities that can't be applied on the mind.
Hi, Dan.
Hey, Nate.
So I'm an undergrad here at Lesley, and homelessness that is visible to me are those in Harvard Square and Central Square. Child homelessness is completely invisible to me, so I feel that seeing this, like being aware of this, is the first step to helping. But what is the next step? What can I do? What is something that I can get involved with, say in Boston, to learn more about this, to be more proactive?
Well, the real experts on child homelessness are the people who have invited me, rather than me, and especially in terms of what to do here locally. I think the program that exists here at Lesley is an impressive program, and there are a lot of structures for helping. But I think part of what one can do, obviously you can go and volunteer at a shelter. You can get to know people in the foster care system. There are all kinds of things that you can do. But you can also talk about this. I was amazed when I said to various people, I'm going to give a lecture as part of this discussion on child homelessness, and how many people said, are there homeless kids? What do the homeless kids do? And the explanation that some of them are homeless in the sense of not having a steady home to go back to, even if they've been placed in foster settings in which they are with a different foster family every 2 months all the time, that also is a kind of home. People said, oh really? How come they don't just stay with one foster family? I just feel it's invisible to the society at large, the problem. So, of course, the hands-on concrete stuff is unbelievably important, but so is having these conversations. And I think if you can try to talk to people about this, if you can become more aware of people beyond the ones you see at Harvard Square and actually incorporate them into the conversation, if you can have a curriculum that addresses these problems, all of those things begin to make a huge, huge difference. I remember being told, again, when I was doing the depression work, I went down to talk to people in Congress, and I met with Paul Wellstone, and who was a wonderful senator, and with Pete Domenici, who was at that time a Republican senator from New Mexico. And I said, if we have programs of aggressive outreach to these impoverished people with depression, it would not only be humane, it would also cause people who are currently a burden on the economy to become productive members of it. So it serves the economic advantage as well as the humanitarian advantage of the country. Why aren't we doing anything? And Domenici said, well, we don't have mandates in this healthcare system. Congress is very resistant to them. And on the line item budget, it's hard to show exactly how much, all of this stuff. And Domenici said to me, we live in a representative democracy. And in a representative democracy, the voters are all represented on Capitol Hill. But the people you're talking about aren't in the polling stations on election day. They're at home with the covers pulled over their heads. And they're not going to have any representation on Capitol Hill until voters begin asking for it. And so I feel likewise, homeless children, there's no more disenfranchised population. And taking care of homeless children is not going to cause them all of a sudden to all show up at the ballot box and vote you into office. So the only way that there can be a change in the way we deal with homeless children is for there to be a change in the way that people who are educated, who do have advantages, and who are voters to really become activists about it. And I think this conference is absolutely part of that process.
So we're going to take one more question. Yes.
Hi. I'm a parent of twins with Tourette's, and your book is very good. So thank you. My question is about love and numbers. We know that the divorce rate in families of poor parenting kids with special needs can be up to 50%. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about how we promote resiliency between adult partners for parenting kids.
I couldn't quite hear what you said was 50%?
The divorce rate amongst families who are raising kids with special needs.
So there, in fact, the question is about what we can do to strengthen resilience and about the high divorce rate of parents and kids with special needs. My overall finding was that there are studies that show that parents of kids with special needs get divorced less often. There are more of them that show they get divorced more often. There are a bunch that show that the rates are consistent with the general population. I found that in marriages that were really strong marriages, that having two parents who were focused on solving a problem together frequently strengthened the marriage. And in marriages that were already somewhat fractured, having this additional strain completely destroyed the marriage. I think if we're looking at less advantaged populations, which I think is what you were asking about, and how to promote resiliency, one thing we could do is to provide the kind of care that strengthens the marriage. So if these people had an adequate amount of respite care so that they weren't unbelievably physically exhausted all the time, if people had enough allowance at work so that when their child with special needs had a difficulty, they could take the time off to be with their child and not be afraid that they were going to lose their job, and with it the health benefits that child relies on. If we were, as a society altogether, to give parents like that the feeling that what they're doing is valid, and not only valid, but admirable, and that they therefore were to receive just praise by way of reward, I think all of those things would strengthen things enormously. But I really think a lot of the problem is just that the actual care of these children is draining and exhausting. And if you have help with it, if you're wealthier and have help with it, it's much easier to bear. And if you're impoverished, I mean, when I haven't had enough sleep for a week, I'm not so pleasant to be with myself. And I can be very short-tempered. And I just think that a lot of these families are stretched to the breaking point, and that we can do a lot of concrete, obvious things to make their lives a little bit easier. And that if we took off a little bit of the pressure, the marriages would heal to some degree, in some cases would heal themselves.
I just want to ask a question about parents that you describe have resiliency. And you mentioned earlier they have somehow found the ability to construct meaning and thus enhance their ability to love far from the tree. Did you find during your interviewing process, or did you sense that some parents were constructing meaning through the dialogue with you?
That's a very interesting, it's sort of a process question, and you've all heard it. Yes, I mentioned to someone earlier that I had a letter from Susan Weinreich, who's in the schizophrenia section of the book, who said, when I read your book, I was finally able to forgive myself. And that was in some ways the most meaningful letter that I've had. There were a lot of people. I just actually had a message this morning from Ann O'Hara, whose story I told earlier, the one with the adopted transgender child, talking about some things that she's going through. And she also said to me at one point, she didn't say that she needed to forgive herself, but she said, when I saw it all put together and laid out that way, I suddenly thought that I'd done a good thing, and I hadn't really thought it through in quite that way before, and she thanked me for that. So I think for a lot of people, telling their stories help. I often asked the people I was interviewing, who told me very painful things and clearly experienced a lot of pain in doing it, I said, why did you decide to talk to me? Why did you decide to let me include your story here? And one after the next they said, I felt so alone with my experience with my child, and if telling my story can help someone else to feel less alone, then I'll feel I've done something really important. And a lot of the people in the book have said to me, telling the story allowed me to take what had happened with all its ups and downs, with all its problems, with all the moments I felt ambivalence about things, and feel that it was all put together and would help someone else, and that was an enormous relief to me. It made me feel better about what had happened. So I think that was part of the process, and I felt lucky to be part of that.